The Henry Hottinger Collection of Fine Violins. Henry Hottinger was a banker with a large collection of fine antique violins. Henry Hottinger was born on February 4, 1885 in New York, and died on March 19, 1979 in Stamford, Connecticut. Henry Hottinger was a founder and member of Wertheim and Company, a firm of investment bankers. Hottinger's interest in musical instruments led to him amassing what some regard as some of the best-known collection of rare violins of the mid-20th century. Hottinger purchased his first violin, a Stradivari, in 1935. For his collection, he strove to find the most outstanding examples of Cremonese masters, and in the case of Stradivari and Guarneri, del Gesù, one example from each significant period of their production. When Hottinger died in 1965, the collection passed to the dealer Rembert Wurlitzer. In 1967, an illustrated catalog titled Our Wurlitzer. The Henry Hottinger collection was published following the collection's sale to Rembert Wurlitzer Co., one of the most well-established string instrument dealerships of the time. 30 violins in all were subsequently dispersed across the world. Now let's step through the stunning instruments that made up the collection. The Dolphin Stradivarius of 1714. The striking appearance and the rich varnish on the back of the violin was likened to the brilliant and changing colors of the graceful dolphin. It was named by George Hart, a violin dealer in London, who owned the violin in the late 1860s. Since then, the violin has been called by the name of Dolphin. This violin was purchased by the well-known amateur player Mr. C. G. Meyer in 1862 from Parisian dealer Jean-Baptiste Voulon. In 1868, he sold the violin to George Hart. In 1875, it was sold to a well-known collector Mr. John Adam, who, among his other collections, in 1881 to 1882, disposed of it to David Lorry, the foremost international dealer of the day. In 1882, the violin was sold to Mr. Richard Bennett of Bolton, a collector as well as an amateur. In 1892, W.E. Hill and Sons acquired the violin from Mr. Bennett and then sold it to Mr. Lionel Walker Monroe, bought it back from him, and then sold it to an excellent amateur player, Mrs. A.N. Stovitt, who retained it until 1915. In 1915, W.E. Hill and Sons repurchased the violin, and it returned to its previous owner, Mr. Richard Bennett. He disposed of his collection including Dolphin in 1926, and in 1935 it passed into the hands of Mr. George Kemp, director of the well-known firm of biscuit manufacturers of the same name. In 1950, it passed into the hands of the violin virtuoso Ysaÿe Heifetz, 1901 to 1987. After Heifetz, the violin was kept in Mr. Henry Hottinger's collection. Since 1970, the violin had been carefully kept by Mr. Cho Ming-sin, a Hong Konger residing in England. Nippon Music Foundation acquired the instrument in February 2000. The back is in two pieces of exceptionally handsome maple, marked by a rather irregular curl ascending from the joint. That of the sides are with medium curl. The scroll is with fainter curl. The table is in two pieces of selected spruce, marked by a fairly even grain of medium width, opening slightly at the flanks. The varnish is rich orange-red in color. This violin has always been referred to as an outstanding example of the golden period of Stradivari's work in the W.E. Hill and Sons book, together with the 1715 Allard and the 1716 Messi. The Siegert King, Jacob Steiner, of 1670, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1954 to 1965. The Harrison Stradivarius of 1693. A perfect example of Stradivari's long pattern, the Harrison was for many years the principal performing instrument of Kyung Wha Chung. It is now part of the collection of the National Music Museum in Vermillion, South Dakota, U.S. The Harrison is one of a few 17th century Strads with its original neck. Many of those instruments were modernized. The neck was tilted to accommodate the tension of metal strings for a fuller sound. Often the original neck was thrown away. but on the Harrison, the neck was modified with a small piece of wood. Harrison was an English solicitor who owned the instrument in the 19th century. At a time many gentlemen played string quartet on Sunday afternoons to entertain themselves in homes. Henry Hottinger owned the instrument from 1957 to 1965. The 1727 Paganini, Count Cosio di Salabue Stradivarius. The history of this violin dates back to Count Cosio di Salabue. In 1817, Niccolò Paganini, 1782 to 1840, obtained this violin, and from his son Baron Achille, Parisian dealer Jean-Baptiste Guillaume acquired it and then sold it to Count de Virail in 1853. In around 1893, the violin was bought by Ernest Niccolini, a tenor and amateur violinist, who was the husband of famous soprano Adelina Patti, 1843 to 1919. It was then passed into the hands of violinist Jan van Oort in 1900 through George Hart, dealer of London. Owing to financial difficulties, Oort sold it back to Hart a few years later. Hart sold it again to Mr. Henry, such in 1903, and repurchased it in 1909. He then sold it to Mr. Brown of Liverpool in 1911. Subsequently, English collector Mr. Frederick Smith obtained it and sold it to W.E. Hill and Sons. In 1914, it was sold to renowned collector Mr. Felix Kahn of New York, and in 1920 it passed into the hands of Ms. Helen Jeffrey. After passing ownership by W. R. Ford and Company in 1927, the violin was purchased by Emile Herman in 1945 and sold to Mrs. Anna E. Clark in 1946, and then from 1964 to 1994 it was owned by the Corcoran Gallery of Arts. Henry Hottinger owned the violin from 1942 to 1944, and the violin is now owned by the Nippon Foundation. The back is in two pieces of maple, marked by a medium curl, sloping slightly downwards from the center joint. The sides are marked by a strong narrow curl. The scroll is marked by medium curl. The table is of spruce marked by bold medium grain, more open at the flanks. The varnish is reddish-brown in color. The 1716 Booth Stradivarius. The name of this violin derives from Mrs. Booth of England, who purchased it around 1855 to 1856 from Parisian dealer Jean-Baptiste Guillaume to assemble a quartet of Stradivari instruments for the use of her children. This violin was exhibited by Mr. Otto Booth at the Lone Exhibition of Musical Instruments held at South Kensington in 1885 and was sold to the dealer George Hart of London in 1889 via W.E. Hill and Sons, who acted as a curator of the violin at the exhibition. The violin was brought to the USA in around 1890 and became the property of Mr. Henry Osborne Havemeyer, a well-known collector. It was then sold to Mr. A.B. Russell in New York in 1930 via W.E. Hill and Sons, and again in 1931 to the celebrated American violinist Misha Mischikoff, 1896 to 1981, through Rudolf Wurlitzer Company. In 1961, it became the property of the collector Mr. Henry Hottinger of New York, who sold it to Rembert Wurlitzer Incorporated in 1965. Through J. and de Beer Limited, the violin was passed to Mr. Cho Ming Sin of Hong Kong, and in 1989 to Iona Brown, 1941 to 2004, a violinist and conductor in England, who used it in many of her performances worldwide, until Nippon Music Foundation purchased it in January 1999. The back is made of two pieces of maple, marked by a handsome curl descending slightly from the joint. The sides are marked by a strong smaller curl, and that of the scroll is similar to the wood of the back. The table is in two pieces of spruce marked by medium open grain. The varnish is orange-red in color. The 1740 Ysaÿe, Bartolomeo Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù. This violin bears the name Ysaÿe from the Belgian virtuoso Eugene Ysaÿe, 1858 to 1931, who used it as his concert instrument for many years. The inscription inside the violin, written in French with red ink, reads, This del Gesù was the faithful companion of my career. Ysaÿe 1928. It is well known for having taken part in the procession of Ysaÿe's state funeral, being carried on a pillow in front of the virtuoso's coffin. Before Ysaÿe, it belonged to the Count Baldeschi, the English collector Mr. John Adam, and Mr. Charles Wilmot, collector and amateur of Antwerp. At the request of the dealer Gand and Bernard L., Mr. Wilmot sold the violin in Paris in 1889 to the father of Miss Carrie Mess, who was a pupil of Ysaÿe and married his brother Theo. In 1896, the violin was passed to her brother-in-law Eugene Ysaÿe. Jeanette Dinson, Ysaÿe's pupil whom he married in 1929, inherited the violin and later sold it to the conductor Charles Munch, 1891 to 1968. Despite the wish expressed by Ysaÿe that the violin remain in Belgium, it was sold to Mr. Henry Hottinger by the dealer Emile Herman of New York. In 1965, it was acquired by the renowned violinist Isaac Stern, 1920 to 2001, and became his primary concert instrument throughout his life. In March 1995, Nippon Music Foundation acquired the violin from Isaac Stern. The back is in one piece of maple, marked by a strong small curl ascending to the right. The sides are marked by a varying, mainly medium curl. That of the scroll is similar. The table is of two pieces of spruce marked by very fine grain at the center, opening towards the flanks. The varnish is orange-red in color on a golden ground. The most striking feature of this violin is the magnificent chipped and mottled varnish of the back. The 1708 Ruby Stradivarius. The ruby is named for the rich, lustrous ruby-tinted varnish that is so well preserved, especially on the back of the instrument. The violin is made on a full model, with a broad appearance to the lower bouts compared to the upper bouts. The back is one of the rare slab-cut backs seen on only a few Stradivari instruments after 1700. According to tradition, one of the ancestors of the Marquis de Pirisis acquired the violin from Paolo Stradivari. In 1905, while it was still in the possession of the Marquis, the celebrated Spanish violinist Pablo de Sarasate admired the violin and left a charming comment to that effect on his calling card. The Hammer firm sold the violin in 1912 to Heinrich Glatz-Neumann, an important Viennese collector who owned a Stradivari quartet. Some years later, the Scandinavian collector Harry Wall owned the violin, and in 1947 the New York dealer Emile Herman sold the violin to the great collector Henry Hottinger of Darien, Connecticut. The violin remained in the Hottinger collection until 1965, when it passed to Rembert Wurlitzer Incorporated. The avid Chicago collector Stephen Junkunk acquired it from Wurlitzer. In 1982, Bein and Fouché placed the violin with the present owner as one of the fine instruments made available for use by exceptional violinists through the Stradivari Society. Since that time, the ruby has been played by a series of remarkable artists, including Leila Josefowicz, Kyoko Takezawa, Maria Bachmann, Vadim Repin, Chen Shi, and Joseph Swenson. Philippe Quint is the current recipient of the ruby. Henry Hottinger was in possession of the violin from 1947 to 1965. The circa 1729-30. Lady Stretton Bartolomeo, Giuseppe Guarneri, del Gesù, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1960 until 1965. The 1679 Hellier Stradivarius. The Hellier violin marks the point at which Antonio Stradivari created an innovative style of violin making, establishing new dimensions and other departures from tradition that would become a blueprint for luthiers for generations to come. It is one of 10 surviving inlaid instruments by Stradivari and is on loan to the Museo del Violino in Cremona since 2009. It is possible to trace the history of the Hellier back almost as far as Stradivari's famous workshop. In fact, several sources, including the Hills, endorse the account that the Englishman Sir Samuel Hellier of Wombourne, a passionate collector of musical instruments and books on music, had bought the instrument directly from Stradivari in Cremona in 1734. Apparently, in a letter to Sir Samuel, Stradivari himself referred to the price the gentleman paid for the instrument, the princely sum of £40. The letter was unfortunately lost sometime around the end of the 19th century. Henry Hottinger owned it between 1957 to 1965. The 1712 Viotti Stradivarius. The year 1712 provides us with a superb example. The violin used by Viotti until his death, when it was sent over to Paris and sold with other effects by public auction. It is of the maker's largest and boldest form, extremely handsome in appearance, the tone being remarkable for luscious maturity of quality and sympathetic responsiveness to the lightest possible touch of bow and finger. The noble beauty of its tone seems to us to echo the elevated style of Viotti's compositions and his broad and impassioned playing. From the book Antonio Stradivarius, His Life and Work by the Hills. This violin was owned by Henry Hottinger until 1965. The 1722 D. Chaponay Stradivarius. The de Chaponay, 1722, was owned by the noble de Chaponay family, near Lyon, France, then bought by a silk merchant in 1876 and, in 1903, by Brighton-based collector, ophthalmic surgeon, and Royal Academy of Music director Charles Oldham. It has since remained in a private collection. The de Chaponay can be traced back to Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume, 1798 to 1875, with its next caretaker being Count Alexander Henry de Chaponay, 1811 to 1878, who acquired it in 1855, though some sources report the sale in 1857. In a letter, Alfred E. Hill wrote, "Although more strikingly beautiful examples of the maker exist, I am of the opinion that none surpass it in the robustness of its construction and purity of its condition." Hill also recorded in his notebook that this violin shows scant signs of the master's age. He was 78. Hill also noted that the violin was of perfect build from a tone point of view, and when the violin was in our care, we regarded it as among one of the finest sounding violins we've ever handled. Indeed, very few violinists have ever had the fortune to play a higher caliber violin. We certainly agree with Alfred Hill that it shows little sign of Stradivari's advancing age. Alexander Henry de Chaponay came from a long-standing noble family from Lyon and had an eye for fine instruments and an ear for fine music. He was a good amateur player and had the means to amass a sizable instrument collection. He was known to host concerts at his house every week with renowned musicians from near and far. De Chaponay was also a bibliophile, and he had a penchant for exquisitely bound and gilded books. His veritable library included history, arts, sciences, and theology texts, but he was particularly fond of Latin and French poetry, French novels, and, interestingly enough, volumes of jokes and pranks. The Count willed his sheet music collection full of string duos, trios, quartets, and quintets to the library of the Lyon Conservatory. This violin was owned by Henry Hottinger from 1949 to 1965. The 1737 Joachim Bartolomeo Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù violin. Owned by Henry Hottinger until 1965. The 1743 Carrodus, Bartolomeo Giuseppe, Guarneri del Gesù, owned by Henry Hottinger until 1965. The Carrodus was made in 1743, when del Gesù was at his most imaginative and creative, but only 1 year before his tragically early death. Its known history begins with a Viennese player named Hellier. In the 19th century, the violin was acquired by the Scottish dealer David Lorry through Vuillaume. Lorry sold it to an amateur named C.G. Meyer, who disposed of it to W.E. Hill. The great English violinist John Carrodus, from whom it takes its present name, bought it from the Hill shop and kept it until he died in 1895. It then passed back to the Hill shop, from which it found its way to a Major Phillips and then to Felix Landau of Berlin in 1909. It was subsequently taken to America and was played by Ossi Renardi until his death in 1955. It then became part of the Great Hottinger and latterly Engelmann collections. It has now been bought by a wealthy patron for the use of the Australian violinist Richard Tognetti, artistic director of the Australian Chamber Orchestra. Varnish. The violin bears a full and original coat of golden red varnish in a polished but pure state. Sound holes. The sound holes encapsulate the Gothic style of late Del Gesù work, with broad extended wings and a slanting, asymmetrical setting. Purfling. Typically slender and rather forced in style, with short, indeterminate bee stings. This is the largest of the models by Del Gesù, but it is based firmly on the classical Amati form. Arching. Full and rounded. The arching confirms the Brescian influences also notable in its companion violin Paganini's Canon, made in the same year. Construction. Evidently built on the traditional Cremonese inner form, the pine linings are mortised into pine corner blocks, and the back and front are located on to the end blocks by small pins abutting the purfling at each end of the body. The interior pinhole mark, found in all instruments made by the Amati family and their direct followers, is evident slightly above the center point of the back. Scroll. The open windings of the scroll relate this violin very closely to the Canon. Its heavy, almost brutal appearance was possibly caused by the failure of Del Gesù to trim the neck block closely to his usual template, which can easily be accommodated within the outline, and by his freehand cutting of the volute. Owned by Henry Hottinger between 1955 and 1965. The 1735 Nestor, Leveque, Rode Stradivarius. Owned by Henry Hottinger sometime before 1960. The 1679 Parera Stradivarius. Previously listed under the name Parera, the violin was in fact named after Pedro Ricardo Parera, cigar merchant, English first-class cricketer and collector from Charlton, Manchester, who acquired it in 1860. This fine example of the master's work has a one-piece back with faint narrow figure, one original wing and varnish of a light golden brown color. Henry Hottinger acquired the instrument around 1957. The 1688 Derenberg Stradivarius. Henry Hottinger acquired the violin after 1950, and it remained in his possession until 1965. The 1714 Berou, Thibaud Stradivarius, owned by Henry Hottinger between 1932 to 1942. The 1716 Cessole Stradivarius, owned by Henry Hottinger between 1944 to 1965. The 1719 Monasterio Stradivarius, owned by Henry Hottinger between 1949 and 1951. The 1727 Venus Stradivarius, owned by Henry Hottinger up until 1965. The 1737 Lord Norton Stradivarius. The violin is named after Lord Norton, who purchased it from George Hart shortly after the sale of the Gillett collection at Christie's in 1872. It was one of no fewer than 10 Stradivarius owned by Gillett, and fetched £180 at the sale. Lord Norton sold it in 1901 to Charles Fletcher of Bournemouth, a well-known violinist and teacher, and the violin then passed in 1908 to a Mr. W.A. Derbyshire, who presented it to Miss Marie Molto, a young and talented violinist. In 1929, it was acquired by the New York dealer Nathan Passeur, and after ownership or use by Alfred Corbin, Samuel Fells, and Daniel Karpolowski, it joined the other fine violins of the Henry Hottinger collection in 1957. Following the purchase of Hottinger's instruments by Rembert Wurlitzer, Inc. in 1965, it was acquired the distinguished American violinist Charles Lebove. The Lord Norton and the so-called Chant du Cygne are regarded as the last instruments made by Antonio Stradivari without assistance, and their quality is remarkable when one considers his age of 93 years. Although certain details of the workmanship naturally reflect the great master's old age, the tone of this violin is of the finest. The 1731 Soil, Bartolomeo Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1944 to 1959. The 1711 Earl of Plymouth, Kreisler Stradivarius. Almost every year, the press reports the discovery of a Stradivari in an attic or some other forgotten places, and the instrument often turns out to be a copy, usually of bad quality. Since the beginning of the 20th century, only a few authentic examples of the Cremonese master's work have been found. The Earl of Plymouth is one of them. For almost 200 years, it rested in a case in the storage room of the Earl's manor house, in the neighborhood of Cardiff in Wales. What's more, its pristine and flawless condition turned the rare discovery into an exceptional event. This violin, which still bears an original label that reads Antonius Stradivarius Cremonensis Facibat Anno 1711, is named after two of its former owners, probably other Louis Windsor, 1731 to 1771. 4th Earl of Plymouth, who was fond of the arts, and the Austrian violinist and composer Friedrich Fritz Kreisler, 1875 to 1962. The back is made from two pieces of maple marked by regular curls of medium width, which slant downwards from the center joint. The ribs are made from a selection of wood similar to the one used for the back, while the head, although also made of maple, is slightly plainer and still shows parts of the black chamfers painted by Stradivari to highlight its charming silhouette. The two-piece belly is made of spruce that is finely grained in the center and opens towards the flanks, where the grain expands to medium width. The varnish is of an orange-red color over a golden ground. Owned by Henry Hottinger from 1952 to 1965. The 1732 Ferni, Bartolomeo Giuseppe Guarneri del Gesù, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1945 to 1950. The 1710 Alessandro Gagliano, Naples, the Rotondo, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1942 to 1965. The Giovanni Battista Guadagnini, Milan, 1751, the More, owned by Henry Hottinger between 1944 to 1952. The Carlo Bergonzi First, Cremona, circa 1732 to 34, the Earl of Falmouth, owned by Henry Hottinger between 1944 and 1965. The Pietro Guarneri of Venice, 1743, the Berou, owned by Henry Hottinger between 1930 and 1965. The Giuseppe Guarneri, Filius Andrea, Cremona, 1716, the Siegert, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1962 to 1965. Vincenzo Ruggieri, owned by Henry Hottinger up to 1965. Andrea Amati, Cremona, 1566, the Charles IX of France, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1950 to 1965. Niccolo Amati, Cremona, 1658, the Hammerly, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1949 to 1965. Francesco Stradivari, Cremona, 1742, the Psalabue, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1959 to 1965. Domenico Montagnana, Venice, circa 1740, the Berenstain-Heil, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1947 to 1958. Pietro Guarneri of Mantua, 1703, the Ysaÿe, owned by Henry Hottinger until 1965. Francesco Ruggeri, Cremona, 1698, the Kirstein, owned by Henry Hottinger until 1965. Girolamo Amati II, Cremona, 1686, the Pearl, Rising Sun, owned by Henry Hottinger until 1965. Giuseppe Guarneri, Filius Andrea, Cremona, circa 1717, the Ritterzahoni, owned by Henry Hottinger from 1958 to 1965. If you made it this far into the video, my fellow violin cognoscenti, then I sincerely say, well done. Camillo Camilli, Mantua, 1730, the Rudolph, owned by Henry Hottinger until 1965. Giovanni Battista Guadagnini, Parma, 1767, the Wilhelms, Hottinger, Reynolds, owned by Henry Hottinger until 1965.
The Doll. Carlo Ferdinando Landolfi violin, 1770. The Topaz, Hottinger, Enrico Cerruti violin, 1858.